Okay. The hour has arrived. It's 12:30. Is there anyone here right now? This is very important. Is there anyone here right now who has not yet taken the midterm? Raise your hand now. If I find out you were here and chose not to raise your hand right now, there will be death by some horrible method for someone, somewhere. Okay. In that case, I'm going to assume everyone who is taking the midterm has taken it, and I just want to take about 5 minutes to go over the 3 questions on the midterm that were correctly answered by less than half of you. These are the ones that presumably are going to be an issue for the greatest number of you, that you're probably going to go and ask your TAs about. And so I wanted to discuss these. I have a list of how many of you put each answer so I can see what most of you thought was the right answer in each case. And so I just want to go over 3 particular questions. Hopefully they've taken the exam. If you're walking in right now and you haven't taken the midterm yet, scream. Okay, so the least successfully answered question on the exam was this one right here. Let me blow this up a bit. Number 17 on Form A. According to lecture, priming only works when? Okay. The answers are A, the prime is applicable to the judgment or behavior to be affected. That's true. B, people are unaware of the purpose of the primes. That's true too. We've talked about that multiple times. This is why social psychologists have people think they're in 2 separate studies so that they don't psychologically link up the priming episode with the next episodes where the primes are relevant to assessing some mental construct. C, people are unaware of the fact that they are being exposed to primes. Okay? Well, they're totally aware that they're being exposed. Okay? We talked about that. The methods that people use when they're exposed, right, are ones that are not subliminal primes most of the time. Okay? So the correct answer, A and B, are both true. So the correct answer is D, both A and B. Okay? Okay, kind of on the same topic. Number 23, Barge and Pietromonaco. Yeah, that's probably how it's pronounced. Barge and Pietromonaco subliminally prime some of their subjects with hostility-related words. Subjects then read about Donald and saw a number of behaviors that were ambiguous with respect to hostility. For instance, refusing to let a salesman enter his home might be a hostile response. After reading about Donald, subjects were asked to evaluate Donald on a number of personal characteristics. Which of the following was observed compared to subjects not primed with hostility? A, okay, as more hostile, they were rated as more hostile and possessing more negative characteristics in general. This is the answer that the vast majority of you gave. And if you simply look at both the figure for this study as well as the extensive discussion about this, this is not true. Okay? They did not show a general negativity effect. They showed an effect only on hostility. So this is the idea that a prime has to be applicable for it to have its effect. And this was discussed multiple different times at different points prior to the midterm. So it's critical that those are applicable primes. It doesn't lead to a negativity effect in general. And that's why C is the correct answer. they rated Donald as more hostile, but not as possessing more negative traits in general. And then the last one, which I think from what I heard was the one that actually got asked about the most in class, and that's not surprising because every year this is the one that gets asked about most in class, is the Greg and Marcia question. Do you guys even know what the Brady Bunch is? Yeah, okay. I wasn't sure if that still exists for all of you. So the question, which I pretty much spoke literally about it multiple times prior to the exam. I actually tried to use an example that's almost exactly the same as this, except I think I used a different animal when I talked about it in class, if you go back to that lecture. The question is, Greg believes his hamster is conscious, but Marcia believes Greg's hamster is not conscious. In fact, Marcia suggests that no hamsters are conscious. According to the lecture on the 2 kinds of consciousness, which is probably true? Okay. And the answer is D. Marcia thinks Greg's hamster has pre-reflective experience. Okay. And I talked about this. If you go back and look at the video podcast of this, you might actually see me winking at you as I gave you this answer quite literally to another example because I know this question's on the exam. Okay. I spend extra time on this, and the idea that I spoke about there is that in general, Greg and Marcia don't actually disagree on anything. They're just using the word consciousness to mean 2 different things. So when someone says a hamster has consciousness, okay, they're referring typically to the idea that a hamster has pre-reflective experience. And when someone says a hamster doesn't have consciousness, they're referring to the fact that a hamster doesn't engage in reflective conscious processing. Okay? So they both agree that hamsters have pre-reflective consciousness and not reflective consciousness, but they're using the word consciousness in 2 different ways. And really, like, if you go back and watch the video, you'll see me like winking and nodding at you. I might even at some point say, this might be question number 26 on the exam. Because I've had this question on the exam in some form for quite a while. And so there you go. Okay, so those are the 3. Every other question, at least 55% or more of you got the answer right. So obviously there's going to be lots of people who have questions about those, but I don't want to take time in lecture to go through all of those. Obviously, you should go see your TAs, and if there's still issues, come see me. So, sorry, I hate talking about exams because exams basically, in my opinion, just take away from people actually learning and getting something out of the class. So I probably hate the exam only slightly less than you do, but I'm sure slightly less than you do. All right, so this is a caption from a cartoon. If you can't read it, it says, during the holiday season, Mr. Arthur Jeffries takes a little time out of each day to think of those who are less fortunate than himself. And when you fill in the rest of the cartoon, you see that he quite enjoys this moment of reflecting on those that are less fortunate than himself. So this is sort of an introduction to our topic for today, which is social comparison. We actually talked about social comparison quite a bit last time when we talked about self-esteem and positive illusions. How do you compare to other people on various traits? But this is where we're going to talk about it a bit more formally. Okay. We are very interested in figuring out how well we're doing, how good we are at any number of different things. We want to know, are we smart? Are we friendly? Are we successful? Are we doing all these things that are characteristics about ourselves that matter to us and to other people? And it's very hard to figure these things out objectively. Like, how do you decide if you're just smart? What's the rule? There is no test that can, be created where we just say, if you are above this number, you can call yourself smart, and if you're below that number, you can't. Right? There is no test like that. There will never be a test like that as far as I can surmise. And so what we typically do, in lieu of just figuring out objectively how high we score on some dimension, is we try to figure out how we compare to others, and we sort of try to figure out, well, how do we rank? So I may not be able to say whether I'm smart or not, but I can say whether or not I think other people are smarter than me, if I'm smarter than some other folks. We can compare ourselves to other people and try to get some information kind of about where we rank. This isn't anywhere on the slides, but for the last 6 months to a year, I've been thinking that one of the keys to genuine happiness in life, really should put this on the slide, except I have no data to back it up. That's why it's not on there. I think one of the keys to genuine happiness in life is to stop using comparison standards for judging ourselves, because they're impossible to ever sort of win out at. There's always somebody. There's always something that's kind of ahead of you. And I think that there's real value when you can sort of pick for yourself what you believe to be some objective standard. Like, if I do this, I don't care how anyone else does on that same thing. If I get this score, then I'm satisfied. And I think that when people can do that, I think it actually leads to a great deal more happiness and satisfaction than comparing yourself to others. But that's not really the point of today's lecture. As we talked about last time, when we compare ourselves to others to figure out if we're athletic, if we're, good at this sport or that sport, or have enough friends or whatever it is, the whole game, intentionally or unintentionally, seems to be in the fact that we choose who to compare ourselves to. Okay? So when you want to think about whether or not you're smart or whether or not you have enough friends, okay, you can compare yourself to people who have many fewer Facebook friends than you, and we all can compare ourselves to that person who's got like 5,000 Facebook friends and actually convince ourselves for a moment that they actually know all of those people. Very unlikely. Okay? But depending on how you choose that person or set of people that you're going to compare yourself to, you're going to get very different feedback out of that comparison process. And in our minds, we probably always think whatever comparison we come up with is reasonable, because we typically think whatever we do is reasonable. We're the reasonable person standard. We are the standard of reasonableness. If I didn't think it was reasonable, I wouldn't have done it. Okay? I know not to compare myself to the Nobel Prize winner. I know that wouldn't be reasonable. So whoever I do choose is someone I think is reasonable. So we rarely doubt the appropriateness of the person we compare ourselves to. And social comparison seems to have two different kinds of functions that it can serve. It can allow us to learn about ourselves, both in terms of where we rank, but also in terms of how we might improve. And it also allows us to kind of regulate how we feel about ourselves emotionally. Okay? And these two things that we can get from social comparison map onto hypothesis 5. That we're motivated to be accurate, to know ourselves accurately, okay? And we're motivated to be likable, to like ourselves and to have others like us. So, sort of getting a little bit more formal about these two functions, Leon Festinger, who is historically one of the most important social psychologists, we're going to talk about him extensively in the next lecture on cognitive dissonance. He invented the concept of cognitive dissonance and collected all the first evidence that cognitive dissonance processes are at work in humans. But before he did that, he was actually quite famous for his work on social comparison and making that a major topic within social psychology. And so he said there were cognitive consequences of social comparison, and the cognitive consequences are the information that those comparisons provide to us. So they can tell us informationally where we rank, if we have some way of assessing objectively where we rank. And sometimes we take tests where we can't know if an 85 is a good score or a bad score, but I know what an 85 is relative to a 90. It's worse. So someone who got a 90 did better than me. And I know it's better than someone who got a 70. So it can give me rank information about where I fall. But it sometimes also gives us other information that is informational and allows us to kind of move forward. So if I am a tennis player, so I'm an amateur tennis player, and I play in tournaments. This isn't true. I haven't played tennis since I was 12. But imagine that I did. Okay, and so you play in all these tournaments, and I can decide to compare myself to, you know, the best person kind of in the amateur tournament or someone who's lower than me. And of course, based on who I choose, I'm going to think I'm either good or bad. Because I'm either focused on the person who's better than me, in which case I'm not so good, or I'm focused on the person that's worse than me, in which case I feel like, oh, I'm doing pretty well. The key thing is when I make what's called an upwards comparison, and an upwards comparison is when you compare yourself to someone who's higher on the dimension than you. So when you make an upwards comparison and you say, wow, they're doing a lot better than me, you can say, well, what are they doing differently? We can model their behavior if we know that they're where we would like to be. So if I know that I'm not doing as well as the best player in the tournament, I may pay extra special attention to what they're doing in the hopes that I can pick up some things that I may apply to, you know, my own game. So upwards comparisons can allow us to figure out what the people who do better than us do in order to do better than us. Okay. But simultaneously, there are emotional consequences. And here, downward comparisons are what makes us feel good. And a downward comparison is when you compare yourself to someone who's lower on the dimension than you are. So if you compare yourself to the person who, you know, has lost more times than you have, you go, ah, I'm doing pretty well. The comparison feels like a positive comparison. So we can choose that. But of course, if we choose that one, we don't get any information about how to improve. We just kind of feel good, but then we're feeling good but not actually doing all that well or as well as maybe we could do. But when we make those upward comparisons, the ones that provide us with more information, okay, it makes us feel bad. Okay? So upwards comparisons simultaneously can provide us with more information about how we could improve, but also make us feel bad because we're thinking about the way that somebody else is better than us. So these are the two categories that are affected by social comparison, cognitive consequences and emotional consequences, and they're not independent of one another. Upwards comparisons has effects on both. Downward comparisons provide us relatively little information, but tend to make us feel good about ourselves. Okay, so let's consider what seems like a pretty straightforward, easy question. Who would you rather see do better at something? A friend or a stranger? How many of you would like to see your friend do better than a stranger? Raise your hands. How many of you would like to see a stranger kick your friend's butt? Okay, good. A few of you. So Robert Cialdini, back in the 70s, looked at times when we really enjoy the people we're connected to doing well at something. Okay? He described this as basking in reflected glory. And for some reason, some people thought this made a good enough acronym, and they called it BURGE. I do not recommend calling it burging, because it just sounds terrible. That doesn't sound like a good thing. I think basking in reflected glory sounds just fine. And this, right, we can deconstruct the phrase here. Reflected glory means the glory of your friend or someone that you're identified with or connected to is reflected onto you, and you can kind of enjoy it. You can sort of bask in what's happened to them, not quite like it's happened to you, but sort of like it has some meaning for you. Okay? And what Cialdini found was he looked at, he was at a very large state school, and he looked at the clothes that students wore on the day after a big game. And what he found was a significantly greater number of people wore clothes with the school insignia on it after a day when the football team or basketball team had won compared to when the football team or basketball team had lost. There was something about their team winning, your team winning, okay, that makes you feel sort of good and want to identify more with that group, the group that sort of shares that identification. And he also found that when people spoke about those games, if their team had won, they tended to say, "We won," but if their team had lost, they said, "They lost." Okay? There was this greater identification with the team who had won than the exact same team who had lost. So people want to be connected to the team in victory, but not in defeat. So here's a case where we're seeing this basking in reflected glory and enjoying the success of people that we somehow feel some connection with or to. But this is not what always happens. Okay? Sometimes it makes us feel badly when our friends do well. And we can understand this from the social comparison processes that we were just talking about. If you're comparing yourself to someone who does better than you, that can make you feel negatively. That can hurt your mood. So Abe Tesser developed a theory of when we will and won't enjoy someone that we're connected to, a friend, doing well at something. And this next slide is not his data. It's essentially a way of showing what his theory is. So this is his theory, not his data. And what he suggested is important is whether or not the thing that they do well in is a self-relevant or non-self-relevant domain for us. Okay? And what he did is he looked at that, and then he looked at whether or not the person who did well was either a weak social tie, meaning a stranger, someone you don't know well, or a strong social tie, a friend, a family member, some kind of significant person in your life. And what he suggested is, and then the y-axis here is how happy would you be if this person or that person did well at either something that was self-relevant or not self-relevant. Okay? And so his theory is you're always going to feel a little bit better when somebody else does better at something that's not self-relevant to you compared to when it is self-relevant. Okay? But this effect is really exaggerated when it's your friend. Okay? So for your friend, so his theory goes, if your friend does well at a self-relevant domain, so you really care about ice skating, and then your friend goes and wins a gold medal in ice skating. Like you are a serious ice skater, and then your brother or your friend wins at that. Okay? This can be very upsetting compared to, if your brother wins a gold medal in ice skating and you don't care at all about ice skating, then the idea is you're like, hey, way to go, brother, that's awesome. Good for you. So it matters how personally relevant to our own identity performances on that dimension are. Anyone in here watch Top Chef? Yeah, right? So the two brothers that are on there, right, they hate each other. They're like two of the three best people in the competition to become like the top chef. And they're just kind of at each other all the time because for both of them, it's a very strong social tie, their brother who's excelling at the thing that they care most about in life. So it's a particularly painful comparison when their brother does really well at this particular thing. So this is called self-evaluation maintenance theory. And that's because what you are trying to do is maintain your positive self-evaluations. And it's very hard to maintain your positive self-evaluations when somebody close to you that you can't help but compare yourself to does really well at something that matters a lot to you in terms of your own identity. So the way he looked at this, it was a very clever study, and there have been various other studies since, but back in the early 90s, he did a game that was kind of like Password or $64,000 Pyramid. There were all these things where there are these games that used to be on in the middle of the day, maybe they still are, where one person has to give a clue to the other person to get them to guess a word or a phrase or something like that. The game Taboo is like the same thing. And so what Tesser did is he brought in two pairs of friends. So you come in with a friend, someone else you don't know comes in with another friend that you don't know. So these two are friends, but they're strangers relative to each other. And he has them in all combinations play this password game. So you play a game where you're providing clues to your friend, and you also play the same game where you're providing clues to a stranger. Okay? And the subjects were told in one condition that how well the person who's answering the clues, so not you who's providing the clues, but the person you're providing them to, Tesser told half the subjects the score they get when they do that is very diagnostic of their true intellectual ability. So someone who gets a lot of those clues and guesses right, they are really smart. And someone who doesn't get many, they're not so smart. And then other people were told, this is just a game and it's not diagnostic of anything. So it's not really relevant to any of your sort of self-identifications because it's just a silly game. And so what he found is that when you were playing with a stranger, so the dependent variable, so what did he look at? And this is the really clever part. The dependent variable was how helpful were the clues that you, the subject, gave to the stranger versus the friend, depending on whether or not the game was going to be diagnostic of that person's intelligence or not. And if it's diagnostic of that person's intelligence, then you might be more inclined to compare yourself to them. And so what they found is that for strangers, it basically didn't matter. You gave them sort of middling, helpful clues. I think this was on a 1 to 7 scale. Okay. But for your friend, if it was just a game that didn't mean anything, you gave your friend super helpful clues. But if it mattered and would indicate how intelligent your friend was, you screwed them. Right? That's what's going on there. Right? You're giving worse clues to your friend than a stranger when this is diagnostic of whether or not that person's intelligent. People are motivated to make their friends look less intelligent so that by comparison, they feel more intelligent. Right? This is all of us. This is what we do. These aren't other people who live in a cave somewhere. This is us. There's always that sort of urban legend about like the hot girl who needs the less hot girl around. Right? It's kind of like this. Make themselves feel good. Oh, I didn't make it up. Don't shoot the messenger. So this is sort of a brief introduction to social comparison and how some of these mechanisms work. Besides explicitly comparing ourselves to others in order to learn about ourselves, another thing we do is we use feedback from others, right, in order to evaluate ourselves. And we talked about this in the context of reflected appraisals a few lectures ago. So people try to use what they think others think of them, or what others explicitly tell them about themselves, to figure out, am I a good person? Am I a bad person? Am I athletic? Am I generous? Am I a hard worker? Pick your dimension, pick your category. And so there's interesting questions that arise about what kind of feedback people like to hear about themselves. Okay. So we talked last time about self-enhancement, positive illusions, people who sort of just want to hear positive things about themselves and think positive things about themselves. Okay? Raise your hand if you think most people in the world tend to be self-enhancers in one way or another, where they want to hear positive things about themselves. Raise your hand if you think most people are like that. Now keep your hands raised if you're one of those people. All right. If I had you do that question first, none of you would have raised your hands. Another way we can put that same question, which makes it feel kind of different, is, okay, do you prefer to be told positive things about yourself even when they aren't true? How many people prefer to be told positive things about themselves even when they aren't true? Raise your hand. Okay, a few of you, much smaller number. but I appreciate the honesty. Thank you. So this has sort of raised a very large debate that's probably a bit quieter these days, just because I think the debate sort of played itself out. But in the 80s and 90s, there was a big debate over whether or not people are fundamentally motivated. I don't know why this slide came out this way. Are fundamentally motivated to self-enhance, and this comes from what's called self-enhancement theory. So self-enhancement theory is basically what we were just discussing. It's people essentially saying, tell me that I'm great no matter what the truth is. And so self-enhancement theory suggests that we are always pushing for positive feedback from others because we want to be liked by others, because we want to be likable. And so people telling us that they like us or think highly of us helps us think, oh, I must be likable and liked by others. And this was probably the dominant theory from Freud onwards, that people are very motivated to hear positive things about themselves kind of no matter what. And then in the late 70s and early 80s, this counterpoint came along called self-verification theory. And this theory is largely associated with Bill Swan, who we're going to see a lot of studies from over the next few minutes. Self-verification theory says, tell me what I already think about myself, what I already believe to be true. Okay? So what I believe to be the truth. And so this is pushing for consistent knowledge about the self. I want you to know and believe and tell me the things about me that I already believe about myself. Okay, so remember, there's the two sides of hypothesis 5. I want to be liked, and I want to be sort of authentic and consistent and accurate about myself. And one extra thing that we need to understand about self-verification theory is that from the insider's perspective, from the experience of someone self-verifying, they don't actually think that they just want to be told what they believe. What they really think, according to self-verification theory, is I want to be told the truth about myself. I want you to tell me the truth about myself. But the hidden part of that is I already know what I believe to be the truth about myself. And so you're only telling me what I believe to be the truth about myself if you're telling me what I already think about myself. Okay? So there is no theory that actually says, tell me the truth and I might not know it. There's the theory that says, don't tell me the truth, I don't care about the truth, tell me you like me. There's the theory that says, verify what I already believe about myself. Because, by the way, I already know the truth about myself. How could you possibly know me better than me? That doesn't make any sense at all. Okay, hopefully by now you know that that might not be the case, that other people could know something about you that you don't know about yourself. So self-verification theory is about wanting people to verify what you already believe about yourself. Okay. So in one of the first studies, and I guess this is more of an 80s and early 90s phenomenon now that I'm looking back at the dates associated with this. One of the first studies to try to kind of pit these against each other, these two different theories, these two different motivations, was a study by Bill Swan and Brett Pelham, who used to be a professor here at UCLA. They brought folks in and they said, okay, I want you to list 5 different personality qualities. And I want you to rate yourself on each of those 5 qualities. So you might list, generosity, athleticism, intelligent, hardworking, and pick your favorite 5th. I don't know. So you pick those, and then you rate yourself on each of those 5 dimensions. So you pick 5 dimensions. Then you are told to rate where do you fall in those 5 dimensions. And then subjects, are asked, how much would you enjoy getting feedback on the dimension that you rated yourself highest on and the dimension you rated yourself lowest on? So if you were going to get feedback from a professional psychologist who was going to look at all your personality data, would you enjoy getting feedback more about your highest or lowest rated quality? Well, no big surprise here. People said, yeah, I'd rather hear about my positive quality than my less positive quality. My best quality compared to my worst quality. So this supports the idea that people are motivated to hear positive feedback. Okay, but it's a simple study. There was an extra wrinkle to this study. Okay, after this phase of the study, the subjects were asked, if you had to hear about both your highest and lowest rated qualities, how much would you want to hear favorable or unfavorable feedback regarding each? So if you had to hear about your best quality, how much would you want to hear the psychologist tell you favorable things about yourself on that dimension or unfavorable things? And for your least good quality, for your worst quality of those 5, how much would you want to hear favorable versus unfavorable feedback? So again, starting with the best attribute, the best dimension, it's not surprising that people say, yeah, I would like to hear favorable feedback about my best attribute. But things start to get a little bit more complicated when you look at what people say regarding their worst attribute. They say, I would prefer to get negative feedback about my worst attribute. Okay? And so this begins to support the idea that self-verification processes are at work. Here, what seems to be going on is people are saying, look, I know I'm not very good at piano. I'm not a real good piano player. So if I'm going to get feedback about my piano skills from someone who's really going to have expertise to give me feedback on that, I don't really want them to go, wow, you're really good at piano. Why? Because it feels inauthentic. I want to hear feedback that I can believe. And if I know that I'm bad at something, I want to hear feedback that's consistent with that confirms my beliefs and authentically describes me. Let's see. So, this one supports, at least on the worst attribute side, self-verification theory. Now, notice that both self-verification and self-enhancement theory are entirely consistent with this data. Right? This doesn't discriminate between the two theories. Why? Because self-enhancement theory says you always want to get positive feedback about yourself, so that predicts that two-cell data. Okay? But self-verification theory says, tell me what I believe about myself. And for your best attribute, you probably think positively of yourself. So you would say, sure, give me positive feedback about that. It's what I believe. So the left-hand side of the graph doesn't discriminate between self-verification and self-enhancement theory. The right-hand side of the graph does, because the right-hand side of the graph has to do with when these two theories come into conflict with one another. So this is where the critical comparison occurs, on the right side of this graph. Now, they did a follow-up study where, sorry, this is the same study. So now you get the feedback. Oh no, this is a different study in the same paper. So in this next study, they take people who have high or low self-esteem. So they just take people who are rated as high or low on self-esteem. Okay, split them into two groups. And these two groups just get generically some positive and some negative feedback about themselves. So they're told some positive things, some negative things. Both high and low self-esteem folks get this. And the assumption of this study is that high self-esteem folks probably have more general positive self-beliefs about themselves than low self-esteem folks. Okay? So it's not too surprising that the high self-esteem folks would say that they thought this feedback, the favorable feedback, was more accurate than this feedback. Okay, so the y-axis is the subject rating how accurate they think the feedback was. The low self-esteem folks, though, flip this. The low self-esteem folks say, you know what? I think the negative feedback, the unfavorable feedback, was actually more accurate. So once again, this is consistent with self-verification theory, not self-enhancement theory. Because if they just wanted to self-enhance, they would say, no, I keep the good stuff coming, I believe it, sure, why not? Okay? But when they start out with these negative self-evaluations, or at least relatively more negative self-evaluations, they tend to be more believing of the negative feedback they get from the psychologist. Now, at this point you'd say, aha, self-enhancement theory is wrong. Freud was wrong. All those suckers were wrong. self-verification theory is what's true. And it sort of is. Okay? But it gets more complicated one more time. See, they also asked in this same study, not just how much do you believe the feedback, how much is it accurate, but how good do you feel after getting the feedback? So these are the same subjects. And what you can see is on the high self-esteem side, if we toggle back and forth between these two graphs, you can see that the high self-esteem folks believe the positive feedback more than the negative feedback, and they feel good after getting the feedback relative to after getting the negative feedback. For the low self-esteem folks, they believe the unfavorable feedback more, but it makes them feel lousy. Okay? So here's the final wrinkle in the self-enhancement, self-verification story. Okay? People will self-verify. If they have negative self-views, they will expect and believe negative feedback more. If they get to choose what kind of feedback they're going to get on their negative attributes, they will choose more negative feedback. But negative feedback makes everyone feel bad. So they can believe it and still feel lousy. So what it seems like might be going on is self-enhancement may be an accurate description of what are going to be the emotional consequences of being given positive or negative feedback, whereas self-verification theory may not predict our emotional responses, but instead it will predict our willingness to request and accept negative feedback about ourselves when we already have negative self-beliefs in that domain. So it's messy, it's complicated. Okay? If we get to choose, we want to hear about our good qualities, and we feel better when we do. Self-enhancement predicts this. And this decision is driven by our affective goals, our desire to feel good, to like ourselves, to have others like us. That's one half of hypothesis 5. But if we have to hear about some particular trait X, we want to hear what we really believe is true about ourselves, but we will also feel bad if that truth is negative. And so this is consistent with self-verification theory. This decision seems to be driven primarily by informational goals, because if it was driven by emotional goals, we wouldn't make that choice. Okay? So it's driven by informational goals, the desire to be authentic, accurate about ourselves, consistent. And even though this is driven by informational goals, it still has emotional consequences. Negative emotional consequences when you get that negative feedback about the negative characteristic. So one of the questions that sometimes comes up in response to this discussion is, what do we really want? Right? Because I'm using want and choose sort of interchangeably to talk about a couple of different things. So it depends on whether or not we're using the word want to say what will we choose, or whether we're using the word want to refer to what will we enjoy. We choose to hear about our best qualities. If we have to hear about our worst, we would choose to get negative feedback. Okay, so those are two different choices. If I get to choose which attribute I hear about, we all choose the positive one. But if I have to get feedback about a particular trait, I will choose to get feedback that's consistent with what I truly believe. Okay? On the other hand, we always enjoy getting positive feedback and do not enjoy getting negative feedback. I'm using always with a lowercase a, meaning I don't really mean always, 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 just typically. Typically, we enjoy getting positive feedback and don't enjoy getting negative feedback. Okay? So why do we ever choose negative feedback? Well, it will make you feel bad. That's not a real good reason to choose it. But we don't want to feel phony. We don't want to feel inauthentic. And we want to feel known by others. This is so important to us. It's so important for us to have it feel like there's a few people, or maybe more than a few people, who really know us as we really are. Okay? And by that, what I mean is, they know me the way I know me. right? They know what I think about me, so that they really understand me. This is one of the things that, as humans, we're most motivated to find in others. Right? One of the fundamental characteristics we look for in a significant other, in a best friend, is someone who really knows us. Okay? Which is kind of odd, because nobody ever lists that when I say, what's your definition of a good friend? And I think that's because when we think of definitions of a good friend, we think about their characteristics independent of us. But this is one of the things I think people care about most in the people that we're close to, is we want to know that they really know the real us, which is what we think is true of us. Okay? There's a term for this, it's called shared reality. We want to know that we're sort of living in the same world in terms of the way we see things and the way you see me. Shared reality. Okay. So, all of this, though, doesn't come up all that often, the intersection of self-verification and self-enhancement, where they sort of are competing motives, because most of the time we have positive self-views. For most things, most of the time, just as we started the last lecture, people tend to have sort of more rosy views of themselves than perhaps they should. And so most of the time, whether self-enhancement or self-verification is at work, we want to hear positive things about ourselves, because we tend to think positively of ourselves. But if we don't, we want to know what we believe to be the truth. We want it to be known by others. We want to sort of continue to think of ourselves in authentic ways and not just think that we're sort of tricking ourselves into believing something that isn't true. All right. So, any questions on this before I move on? Yep. There's no such thing as unfavorable positive feedback. No. The feedback is always either... So let's go back here. Okay. So... Right. So best and worst attribute in this study is self-defined. So you've said, I'm a 10 out of 10 on this attribute, and I'm a 3 out of 10 on this attribute. And now we're going to say, okay, well, we're going to have a professional psychologist read your profile and tell you how you really are on these. And the question is, how do you respond when a professional psychologist tells you you're a 10 out of 10 or a 3 out of 10? So this has to do with what the psychologist expert's going to give you feedback on. These have to do with how you've self-selected the attributes that you think you're good or bad at. Yep. That's right. That would be unfavorable feedback about your best attribute. If you thought you were a 10 out of 10 and the psychologist said you're a 2 out of 10, that would be unfavorable feedback about your best attribute in that study. Affective goals? Yeah. Affective goals just means emotional goals. So we want to feel good. We want to feel likable. So it's sort of social emotional goals. So we want to feel good about ourselves. We want to feel that we're a good person. That makes us feel good about ourselves. We want to know that other people think we're likable and a good person. That's all I mean by affective goals. All right, so we're going to move on. I'm going to catch back up half of one of our lectures. This never happens. Okay, so Leon Festinger again. Leon Festinger was probably the most important social psychologist between 1950 and 1965. Real big deal, and maybe then he was superseded by Milgram, but that's the only possible person who has ever superseded him. Festinger wrote a book called When Prophecy Fails, and he talked about sort of these various cults that have these doomsday prophecies, that the world is going to end. Okay? And we still hear about one of these every 5-10 years. There's some group that has received a prophecy that the world is going to end. And Festinger didn't have to just do his research in the lab. He could go out and do field research in very clever ways. So there was this woman, Marion Keech, okay, who somewhere, I think, in early November 1954, received a message from aliens that the world was to be destroyed at 7 a.m. on December 21st, 1954. Okay? And the aliens also told her that she and whichever followers were around her at midnight the night before this, so 7 hours earlier, whoever was congregated with her, they would be saved. And only they would be saved. Okay? And so at first, she didn't tell anyone at all about this. She just kept it to herself, and then she told a friend. She was like, this really weird thing happened to me, and I'm kind of uncomfortable telling you about it, but I'm going to tell you. And the friend believed it whole hog. The friend said, oh my God, the world's going to end. You have to tell people. It's so important. So they did some newspaper interviews, and it became national news. To the point where thousands of people gave up their lives and traveled to where she was living and basically camped out at her house on her block, okay, and formed a little cult called the Seekers. Okay? These were like lawyers, doctors, all walks of life. Just gave up what they were doing. Some of them left their families, and they came here, okay, to be with Marian Keech so that when the world ended on December 21st, they would be spared. Okay, so they lived at her house on her property for the week leading up to December 21st, midnight. And of course, as you all know, okay, midnight on the morning of December 21st, 1954, the world ended. No, nothing happened, of course. Okay, that's the track record for all of these prophecies. Okay, nothing happened. Nobody was rescued. The world was not destroyed. So what happens now to the Seekers? These people who have given up their careers. Some of them left their families. Okay? They're now sitting here at 7:05 a.m. Uh-oh. Guess, geez, we were wrong. Something bad. And now we have an account of all this, and I should have mentioned this earlier. The reason we have a detailed account of what happened is because Festinger went and lived with all those people. So he pretended to be a seeker. He didn't get IRB approval. They didn't have IRB approval back then. But he basically went and said, I've given up my career. I'm one of you now. So he went and lived with them. Okay, so he knew exactly what was going on. And he says in the book, 7:05 a.m., people look stressed. Like, I bet everything on this being true. I left my wife. I left my career. I left my house. And now nothing happened. Uh-oh. Uh-oh. So all these people are looking really distressed. And so the inner circle goes inside Marian Keech's, kitchen. The sort of 6 or 7 key players who have been kind of the leaders in this group go inside, and they come out 20 minutes later. Okay? And do they come out and say, well, guys, sorry, guess we got it wrong. Turns out Marian Keech is schizophrenic and just hears things. No. Instead, they come out and they say they believe God was so impressed with their response to the prophecy that he saved the whole world. Okay? So in the face of utter disconfirmation of what they believed, they managed to come up with something that can not be described by any word other than complete rationalization. They managed to come up with this solution that suggests that what they believed all along was true, but now the rules have changed and God has taken mercy on the whole world because they were such good believers themselves. Okay? So today, or for the remaining 20 minutes of today, we're going to start talking about rationalization. Okay? So it's not just the seekers who rationalize. Okay? We all do it. And by we, I mean all of you and me. The guy who's opening the door in the back right now to come in, he does it too. But he doesn't know what it is yet because he couldn't hear what I was just talking about. We do it when it comes to the schools we do and don't get accepted to the jobs that we successfully get or don't get, or lose or don't lose. We do it a lot when it comes to dating, right? So it's like, oh, I'm so crazy about that person. She won't go out with me. I never liked her anyway. She sucked. Right? That's a biggie. A lot of rationalization in our relationships. If you ever watch any kind of reality shows, right, when people lose, it's always like, well, they kicked me off because I was the strongest competitor. That's always what it is. Or they always say, like, I know I'm only the third, it's only the third week of the show and I got kicked off, but this has really given me a great head start and you haven't seen the last of me. But it's always the last we see of those people, right? I mean, by definition, it almost is. You are the third worst person on a reality show. There's no future in reality shows for you. And from the outside, when we look at all these people rationalizing, right, it looks profoundly inauthentic, right? So if you're the friend of the person who couldn't stop obsessing about some girl that he was totally going to go out with and he was crazy about and blah, 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 and then he finds out that she won't go out with him and he's like, yeah, I was never into her. You're like, yeah, you were. You're an idiot. Of course you were. You couldn't shut up about, no, I was never that into her. What? Right? So it looks profoundly inauthentic to us from the outside. And so I want to talk about why people rationalize and how the process works. Okay? And this is one of these sort of paradoxes about Hypothesis 5. We're very, very motivated to see ourselves as authentic and consistent. And it turns out that sometimes we will do things that are profoundly inauthentic and inconsistent in order to be able to tell ourselves that we are authentic and consistent. Okay, I know that sounds kind of odd, but sometimes we sort of bend the truth in our own minds so that from our own perspective, it feels like we've continued to believe something that's consistent all along. And from the outside, it looks like, wait, you just changed your story. But what I'm going to suggest is from the inside, it's not so simple. It doesn't always feel like we've changed our story, even when we have. So we're going to start with what's called balance theory. This comes from Fritz Heider. Okay. He did a lot of important work. He was one of kind of the founders of social psychology back in the 40s. He came over from Germany during World War II. Okay. And this isn't about rationalization so much yet, but it's the precursor to Festinger's big theory of cognitive dissonance. So Heider said, people want to be consistent. They're motivated to be consistent in general. If I believe something yesterday, I should believe that same thing tomorrow. But they're also consistent. They want to be consistent in terms of the beliefs they have with other people they identify with. Okay? So we like people who like what we like. That's another way of saying we sort of share the same values and beliefs. Okay? And he put these in a very sort of simplistic way of describing them, but one that I think captures the essence of this idea, is that he basically said, look, you can have you and some other person, we'll call that person Jim, okay? And you can both have beliefs or attitudes towards many things, in this case, stealing candy. So let's assume these are 12-year-olds, right? I'm guessing most of you are past the point when stealing candy seems like that exciting of an idea, so assume they're 12. And the pluses and minuses refer to the sort of positivity of feeling or belief. So you like Jim, so that's why there's a plus sign there. You don't like stealing candy. You think it's bad or morally unacceptable. But Jim likes stealing candy. That's why he's got a plus sign there. And what Heider suggested is that this is what's called an unbalanced triad. So that's at the bottom here. A triad just means three. So you've got these three nodes, and it's unbalanced. Right? And you can just tell by understanding those relationships that it's unbalanced. If you like something, if you like someone, and the two of you feel very differently about something, that creates an imbalance or inconsistency in the relationship. Okay? And there's a sort of a mathematical way of actually thinking about this. If you imagine that there's a 1 next to each of the plus and minus signs, and then you multiply them all together. So you multiply plus 1 times minus 1 gives you a negative number. Plus 1 times plus 1 times plus 1 is 1, times minus 1 is minus 1. Whenever you get a negative number, when you multiply out one of these triads, it's an unbalanced triad. No matter where the pluses and minuses are, if you get a minus when you multiply them out, it's unbalanced. And he suggested that in this case, we're motivated to restore balance. We don't like this state where there's imbalanced triads. Okay, we don't like that state. It feels negative to us. Remember on the first day I described the yucky feeling, right? When I sort of set you up to have that conflict between sort of being respectful of authority but also doing what the authority figure asks of you. Okay? This is kind of the same thing. It actually gives us a negative feeling when we're against something and someone we value is in favor of it. Okay? It puts us ill at ease. And so there's two ways that you could solve this problem with Jim. Okay? On the one hand, you could come around to Jim's point of view and say, you know what? Stealing candy's all right with me. I like stealing candy. Let's go. Okay? And now you got pluses everywhere, and you multiply those all out, and now it's a balanced triad, because plus 1 times plus 1 times plus 1 is 1. The other alternative is that you could say, you know, Jim, I'm not so high on you anymore. If you don't like stealing candy, I just don't think we can be friends. And so if you change your view of Jim, you now have two negatives, and a negative times a negative is a positive. So this restores balance as well. If I don't like Jim, right, then it doesn't matter that he likes stealing, because I don't like him. Okay. Now the third alternative, which I don't have up here, is you could have just convinced Jim to stop liking stealing. But that's hard to do. You don't know Jim like I know Jim, so we'll leave that one aside. The important thing here is, Heider is always talking about two people and their attitudes towards one thing. Okay? So the conflict is interpersonal. Interpersonal means between people. So there's always multiple people involved when Heider is talking about balance theory. It's a conflict between your beliefs and somebody else's beliefs. What Festinger did was he said, okay, you know what, we can get rid of the other person altogether and just focus on your own beliefs. We don't have to have a second person there at all. We could focus on the inconsistencies in your own beliefs and get very similar psychological phenomena at work here, where it's distressing to have the unbalanced version of these triads, and we're motivated to relieve that distress and achieve balance or consistency. So this led to what Festinger called cognitive dissonance theory. That's him right there. He kind of looks like a nice guy, although from people I know who knew him, they said he was the biggest jackass ever. I'm just saying. But his theories are really important. So it doesn't matter. You still have to know them for the final. So up there, right, those 2 bullet points, Festinger wanted to focus on intrapersonal conflict that's within a single individual, rather than balance theory, which is interpersonal. And the idea is that if 2 of your own cognitions, 2 of your own thoughts, beliefs, attitudes, conflict with each other, they will cause a state of dissonance. Dissonance is the same as that yucky feeling that I told you about on the first day. Dissonance, probably the best example to sort of make the idea easily accessible, is if you just bang a couple keys on the piano that shouldn't be played together and it just sounds terrible. Those are dissonant notes being played together. Consonant notes are the notes that go together in a chord and sound really nice, or at least reasonable. Dissonant notes are the notes that don't go together or aren't supposed to go together, and it really kind of hurts our senses to hear dissonant sounds. Well, he's suggesting that there's sort of a psychological dissonance that feels bad when we put together two cognitions, just like two piano notes, that don't go together. So dissonance is an aversive feeling. Aversive just means negative. Okay. And what he suggested is that we're motivated to address these imbalances, and there's three ways you can cope with the dissonance that you're feeling. Or in other words, there's three ways to engage in dissonance reduction, eliminating that negative feeling. One way is to change an attitude. So if you've got two attitudes that are in conflict with each other, you can change one of those attitudes. And if you change one of those attitudes and now the attitudes are consonant with each other, the dissonance should go away. Sometimes you can change a behavior. So, let's say on the one hand, you think stealing is bad, but on the other hand, you've gotten yourself into a situation where, it's some initiation for something or other and you've got to go steal a piece of candy. Right? So there's dissonance there because you feel conflict between your belief that stealing is bad and the action that you're about to engage in. And so one option here is to change your behavior and not engage in that stealing. But sometimes it's too late. See, sometimes you already went through and stole the candy, and now you're just thinking about the fact that you believe stealing is wrong and you believe you just stole candy. Right? So those two cognitions, those two thoughts are in conflict with each other, and there's no way to change the behavior because time only works in one dimension. It goes forwards, not backwards. If anyone invents a time machine, let me know. My dad would be very interested. He likes science fiction. In any event, the last option for dissonance reduction is to justify or minimize the conflict. Right? So you might say to yourself, look, I believe stealing is bad, and I'm aware that I just stole candy, but look, I just stole candy from Walmart. Okay? They're a big company. It doesn't really matter. I stole a 25-cent piece of candy. They'll never notice. It's not that big of a deal. It's not like I stole somebody's house where they don't have a house anymore because I stole it and put it somewhere else. Okay? So in this case, I wouldn't be denying either of my cognitions. I wouldn't be saying, oh, stealing isn't bad, and I wouldn't be saying I didn't steal, but I'd be saying in this particular case, there's some other way that I can justify it. And typically what we say when we try to justify that sounds like rationalization to a lot of other people. Okay. So just a few examples. Okay, so you can ignore the first one. That has to do with an example I used to do in class that I don't actually do anymore. Let me cut that out of here. In the cult that Festinger went and visited, right, people had the belief that the world will end. That's the prophecy. But then they have a second belief that the world didn't end. So this creates dissonance. Okay, with work, you wanted a particular job. That was what you were hoping for. You didn't get it. That's dissonance. Relationships, she's wonderful, but she dumped me. Okay, those things are dissonant with each other. Okay? Military, killing is bad, but also believing that war can be necessary. Someone can simultaneously hold both of those beliefs, but it can also create dissonance when you think about both of them at the same time. So there are a number of different studies, paradigms, that have been used to illuminate this idea of cognitive dissonance and cognitive dissonance reduction. So we're going to talk about a few of them right now, and then we'll continue on next time. But we're going to start with the most famous. This is probably the only one we'll get through before the end of class. The most famous paradigm for studying cognitive dissonance is called the insufficient justification paradigm. This comes from Festinger himself. And imagine that you're a subject. It's 1955 or so when they ran this. Okay? You come in and you're asked to do some incredibly silly, uninteresting, boring task. So you're given a stack of sheets of paper, and on the paper are all these triangles, circles, and squares. Okay? And what you're told to do is, everywhere you see a triangle, put a circle around it. Everywhere you see a square, put a triangle inside it, and stuff like that. And so you just do this for page after page after page for an hour. And every time you finish a page, you put it over here, do another one, finish a page, put it over here. Incredibly boring. unambiguously boring. Now, you're done, and you've been paid whatever little amount you got paid to be in this study. Okay? Maybe they got class credit. Probably not. They didn't do that back then. Maybe they got paid a little bit of money. At this point, everyone has gone through the exact same experience, and everyone has been paid the exact same amount for being a subject in that incredibly boring study. But then things get a little interesting for the first time in the study. The experimenter says, the next subject is in the waiting room, and usually I have someone who goes and greets the next subject, but that person isn't here. So I was hoping that you could be my greeter just for this one subject and go out and get the next subject ready for the study. What I need you to do is go out there and tell them that this is a really fun task that they're going to really enjoy. Okay? A complete lie. Nobody is going to enjoy this task. Okay? But the experimenter asks you, will you go tell the next person that this is going to be a fun and interesting study for them to participate in? And the experimenter then offers you money to go do this for them. So he says, I can pay you to go sort of serve as my greeter. For half the subjects, they're told, I will pay you $1 if you'll go do this for me. And the other half of the subjects are told, I'll pay you $20 if you'll go tell the next subject, right, that they're going to have a fun and enjoyable time in this study. Okay? This payment is totally separate from the payment that they've already gotten for doing the boring task. Okay? After they go and talk to the next subject, because everyone agrees to go talk to the next subject and tell them it was a fun and interesting study. Okay, just about everyone agrees in these studies. After they're done doing that, the subject is asked to fill out a brief little questionnaire where they indicate how much they, the original subject, actually liked the task that they did. Okay, so now you're really, really done, and the question is, how much do you retrospectively say you liked doing that incredibly boring square triangle task? Okay, so what do you think? Who says they liked doing the task more? The people who got paid $20 to lie to the next person, or the people who got paid $1 to lie to the next person? Raise your hand if you think it's the people who got paid $20 to lie to the next person said they liked the task more. Okay? And raise your hand if you think the person who got paid $1. Okay, so about a 50-50 split. Okay? Turns out that, in fact, the people who got paid $1 said retrospectively that they liked the task way more than the people who got paid $20. Okay? The people who got paid $20 said they didn't like the task at all. The people who got paid $1 said, yeah, I thought that was a pretty good task, sure. Okay? Now, why is this? Why is this? Well, okay, everybody, for the most part, probably has these two cognitions when they go through this study. Lying is bad, and I just lied. Okay? In the $20 condition, they can generate a reasonable explanation. They can say, lying is bad, and I just lied, but I just told a little small inconsequential lie for $20. And remember, this is 1954. So $20 in 1954 is like $7 million today. Okay? So, you know, that's okay. I can tell a little lie for $7 million without changing either of those two beliefs. So I don't have dissonance, and you don't see any attitude change. You don't see me saying now that I suddenly like the task more because I have a sufficient justification for why I lied. But in the $1 condition, I can't really tell myself that it was okay to lie to someone for $1. That doesn't feel justified. And so if I can't justify my lying with the small amount of money I got paid, okay, I've got to do something else to deal with the dissonance that occurs. And here's what I can do. I can change my beliefs about how much I enjoyed the task. See, if I can convince myself I really enjoyed the task, then I didn't just lie. Okay? So if I can't justify this relationship, I can change how I feel about the task. I can convince myself I really liked it, in which case I didn't lie, in which case there's no conflict, and the dissonance goes away. Okay? So in this case, you have insufficient justification. We'll revisit this when we come back because I know that's a lot to take in. We're done, so I will see you next Tuesday. Have a good weekend. I'll put the other notes up today. I don't know. I don't track the podcast because I don't control those. It gets done by the people back in that booth. Usually they're up within a day or so, but I don't definitively know. They weren't up last night. Right, and that's entirely possible. It's kind of crazy midterm time, I guess. But yeah, sure. What's that? Why didn't they change their belief? Because they were paid enough that they can say, you know, lying in general, it's a bad thing. You shouldn't lie. But I lied for such a little thing, and I got paid a ton of money to do it. I'm okay with what I did. I don't feel bad about it, right? So if I said right now, if I give you $1,000, you know, will you tell him that it's going to rain tomorrow? You'd say, sure, I'll tell him it's going to rain tomorrow for $1,000, and you won't feel bad about it. Because what consequence does it really have? It doesn't hurt anyone. You get paid a ton of money, so it's acceptable. You can justify it.